From business culture to Great Depression, 20s, 1920 to 1932, Chapter 20. Yes, I found a different format and I thought I'd give it a try. I'm sure we get tired of doing the same thing the same way all the time. I don't know if I'm going to like it or not, but we'll see. Okay, in May of 1920, at the height of the Red Scare, police arrested two Italian immigrants alleged to have participated in a Massachusetts robbery at a factory in which a guard was killed. He accused Nicholas Sacco, a shoemaker, and Bartholomew Vincetti were anarchists who hoped for a society without government, churches, and private property. They did see violence as an appropriate means for enacting social change. But there was very little evidence linking them to the crime. Eyewitness testimony was contradictory and other evidence was disputed. But nevertheless, in the anti-radical and anti-immigrant atmosphere of the Red Scare, their conviction was inevitable. When the men were found guilty and sentenced to death, their multiple appeals garnered international attention and sympathy. A movement to save their lives attracted support from many in the United States, including Felix Sandberger, a future Supreme Court judge. The governor of Massachusetts responded to protests by appointing a commission headed by Abbott Lawrence Lowell, Howard University's president and a longtime official of the Immigration Restriction League. Unfortunately, the commission upheld the verdict and death sentences, and on August 23rd, 1927, Sanko and Vanzetti were executed by electric chair. On the left, you've got the death watch in Times Square, and on the right, you've got there again, Times Square. It was just a mass holiday almost. It was almost like the hangings prior to this time. The Sanko Vanzetti case exposed much about America in the 1920s, from the Red Scare's erosion of civil liberties to the cultural divisions sparked by immigration, and the seemingly triumph of capital labor over labor in the decade of apparent prosperity. Even though the decade has been called the Jazz Age and the Roaring Twenties, signaling its innovations in music, its sexually liberated women, the roaring stock market, and consumer goods, not all Americans welcomed the emerging secular commercial culture. Some feared ethnic and racial diversity and what they saw as the moral degradation of urban life, and they expressed their appreciation in anti-immigrant and religious sentiment. It was really bad. It really was. I don't know how to explain it. If the people are frightened, they do and come up with strange things, and people were frightened. President Calvin Coolidge, he became president when Harding died, and then he was elected president. And he always said that the chief business of the American people is business. Economic expansion, partnership between business and government, and business values seemed greater in the 1920s than any previous decade in our history. And after the post-war recession receded in 1920, the decade was one of an extraordinary prosperity. Productivity and output skyrocketed, and new industries such as chemicals and electronics grew, and older industries adopted Ford's moving assembly lines. Automobiles so stimulated the economic growth that auto factories, not iron and steel mills, came to embody the American industrial power. Car production tripled in the decade. General Motors surpassed Ford, and by 1929, half of all American families owned a car. The auto industry sparked the growth of steel, rubber, oil production, road construction, and a bunch of what I call umbrella industries. It also promoted tourism and the expansion of the suburbs. In this decade, America's multinational corporations also extended their penetration of international markets. The dollar became the most important currency in the world trade, where it had been the English pound, and American industry still led the other nations in output. In the 1920s, consumer goods for the first time became obtainable by most Americans. Goods made available by credit and installment buying plans like vacuum cleaners and telephones and washing machines and refrigerators. These all transformed daily life, especially of the woman. And advertising and marketing professionals found new ways to compel the Americans to purchase the items from the new industrial cornucopia. I mean, we couldn't buy it if we didn't know we needed it. Americans began to spend more time on leisure activities, from vacation to sports and movies. Radios and phonographs brought mass entertainment into private homes and birthed a new celebrity culture. One French visitor wrote in 1928 that a new society had emerged in which Americans valued their standard of living above all else. Americans' willingness to amass enormous debts in order to purchase consumer goods seemed to replace 19th century values of thrift and self-denial. Once, work seen as a point of pride and skill, or collective employment in trade unions, now seemed only a means to pursue individual fulfillment through consumption and entertainment. But there is a downside to everything. Despite the abundance of mass consumerism in the society, the fruits of economic expansion were very unequally distributed. Real wages rose only by 1/4 between 1922 and 29, and corporate profits rose as much more than twice that rate. That doesn't sound good, does it? And economic concentration continued. More to the rich and less to the not rich. And with a smaller number of firms and banks controlling more of industry and finance in the early 1929, the share of national income of the wealthiest 5% of American families exceeded that of the bottom 60%. The majority of families had no savings, and 40% of Americans lived in poverty. 40%, folks. Unable to enjoy the new consumer economy, but now improved productivity allowed goods to be made with fewer workers. And while employment grew in some sectors, such as the professions and retail and education, manufacturing employment dropped significantly for the first time in American history. Deindustrialization began in the old industrial Northeast as businesses began to move south to take advantage of the cheap, non-union labor. Sound familiar? Farmers were also excluded from prosperity. American agriculture had reached the zenith in World War I when Europe's need for food and government policies had kept farm prices high. But increasing mechanization and use of fertilizers and pesticides elevated output even as world demand stagnated, steadily reducing farm incomes and forcing tens of thousands of farms into foreclosures. In the 1920s, for the first time in the United States history, the number of farms and farmers declined. Extractive industries such as mining and lumber also suffered from overproduction in the market. Even before the 1930s, rural America was suffering from economic depression. And we're not seeing it, folks. This is the biggest problem, is these things are going on and we're not seeing it. All we're seeing is the outside. It looks like a very healthy watermelon. We don't see what's going on the inside. And even before the 30s, rural America was suffering from economic depression. And although high unemployment crippled much of Europe in the 1920s, America's high wages and effective industry and mass consumption projected a magical image of American wealth and permanent prosperity across the world. That's the key, permanent prosperity. After all, in America, this decade was always better than the last decade. We want the world to be better for our children than it was for us. The Committee on Public Information's propaganda campaigns during World War I had persuaded advertisers that it was possible to sway the minds of whole populations. And many businesses began to establish what we call public relations department to defend corporate practices and win over a distrusting public. And they successfully changed the public attitudes toward Wall Street. Congressional hearings from 1912 to 1914 held by Louisiana Congressman Arsenio Pujo had exposed the big Wall Street bankers' manipulation of stock prices and strengthened popular views that investors were being fleeced in the stock market. But by the 1920s, however, with stock prices rising, the market gained more investors, and by 1928, 1.5 million Americans owned stock, more than any previous time in our history. And you could buy stock and buy it on margin. You could like $1 down and $1 a week, so to speak. And the only problem is when the stock market's going to crash here pretty soon, if you don't have it paid for, you've got to have to come up with the money. But the credit thing that's going on right now is just growing like yeast. Everybody's taking advantage of it. And with the defeat of the 1919 labor revolt and the dissolution of the wartime regulations, businesses used the language of Americanism and industrial freedom against the unions. Some corporations in the 1920s adopted new styles of management called welfare capitalism. And they were offering employees private pensions and medical insurance plans and job securities and leisure programs. Wow. These businesses celebrated their attention to the human factor, but more employees adopted the American plan. The Spaces was the open shop, a workplace free of government regulations and unions, except in some cases company unions that were created and controlled by the management of the company. They believed collective bargaining infringed on the liberties of management and argued that prosperity depended on complete freedom for businesses. Public relations campaigns linked unionism with socialism and sinister foreigners, and even progressive companies hired strikebreakers and detectives and blacklisted union members to prevent or defeat unions and strikes. So in this hostile environment, unions lost more than 2 million members, and unions began to capitulate to employer demands in order to prevent their annihilation totally. And like unions, feminists tried to adapt to the new conservative atmosphere of the 1920s. Suffrage being granted in 1920 had ended the ties of solidarity that had united various groups of women, the reformers, and black feminists now insisted that the movement demand the enforcement of the 15th Amendment in the South. But white activists offered little support. The long-standing divisions between the two competing conceptions of women's freedom, one based on motherhood, the other on individual autonomy and the right to work, now took shape in a debate over something called the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, to the Constitution. It was advocated by Alice Paul and the National Women's Party. The proposed amendment would eliminate all legal distinctions on account of sex. And Paul argued that now that women had the vote, they no longer needed special legal protections and needed equal access to employment and education and other opportunities, not protection. But women reformers who supported the mother's pension and laws limiting women's work hours, which the ERA threatened to dismantle, vehemently opposed the ERA. Every major women's organization other than the National Women's Party opposed the ERA. And the ERA campaign failed, and in 1929, Congress repealed the Spencer-Howard Act of 1921, which had offered federal assistance to programs for infant and child health. And we'll have another about, I guess in the late 70s, early 80s on the ERA again, which we'll get to in a couple of chapters. Pre-war feminism and their emphasis on personal freedom blossomed in a growing consumer society, and women's liberation became a lifestyle promoted by advertisers and mass entertainment. Detached from political or social radicalism, sexual freedom now meant individual autonomy or personal rebellion. The young single flapper who smoked and danced and shortened her hair and skirts and used this new birth control device called a diaphragm came to symbolize the new woman. Here we have a picture of the new woman. On the right, you've got going to work. Now, just a very short time ago, we were wearing bloomers and skirts down to the ground, and our hair was long, and we wore girdles and corsets, and getting our hair cut and getting out of those corsets and shortening our clothes. I mean, the women just felt like they could actually move again. And on the right, you've got a woman who's got with a leg flask. I still have my mother's leg flask. It's very small, very dainty, and it's carved. It's not real silver. It made it look like silver, but it's very, very pretty. And I don't think it held more than 2 shots. But it was something that she would put in her garter when she went out because she was dating during this time. And of course, flappers dancing the Charleston, which was one of the major dances. And bathing suits. Oh my gosh, look, you can see the legs. Oh my Lord. Are we being scandalous? You bet we are. These women are just downright, well, they're harlots. So you've got a changing image and changing expectations. It's an exciting time, but it's a struggle because now we had to fit the role of these images that are in the magazines. We have to be thin to feel loved, to be accepted by the public. And women have become extremely conscious of shape and message. And of course, the fashion industry is setting the standards, and we are buying it. They're mass producing everything. No more personal fit. You go to the store and buy everything, and of course, the flappers' clothes didn't fit that tight anyway. They wanted to be lace. But the way they're being portrayed at this time, it's got a boyish figure with no hips or breasts, and sometimes they take bands and things and wrap around their breasts so they wouldn't show. Tiny waist. No more corset. Now we got a rubber girdle that just barely holds up our stockings if we wear them. And no longer was fat healthy even when you're with a child, because you're constantly dieting. And this machine, Oh, you had to exercise and diet to keep your young lady figure slim and trim. And of course, the fashion industry and the other businesses are feeding off our insecurities. And women begin to think they had to suffer to be beautiful, constantly comparing themselves to models in magazines. And we have women today who do the same thing. In past, women thought to be weaker, now judged on appearance. Now, is this the independent woman that she's become a slave to the fashion industry? The public perception of this person called a flapper. She's got short skirts and short hair. She wears makeup. She drinks in public. She smokes in public. She's actually driving automobiles. And she goes in for heavy petting. And she has gals as pals to boyfriends. This is unreal. I mean, you're seeing a man without a chaperone. And in sports, well, they're interested in golf and tennis and swimming. They share the interests that their male friends have. The careers in social reformers declined. Now we've got careers in teaching and nursing and social work and libraries. When we go to college, we learn how to do something other than read French and write poetry. But the older generation of ladies, the mothers of these flappers, of course, they're horrified. And they always said, today's woman gets exactly what she wants, like any glassware she wants. If she wants it in sapphire blue or a soap dish to match the bathroom's color scheme, she gets it. It's wild. So we're going to leave the world of the flapper for a moment. I sometimes wish I'd been born during that time, and sometimes I'm glad I wasn't. Harlem Renaissance. Now, I think you probably noticed by this time, this information for the most part is in your text, but not in the order I'm giving it to you on this lecture. Because, well, the Harlem Renaissance basically came about because of the migration during World War I. Newfound confidence from the war in W.E.B. Du Bois' crisis writing. James Weldon Johnson, he's in the NAACP, his writings also. They are always convincing. Be proud to be black. But Harlem was considered the black cultural capital. And we're beginning to see this rising black self-consciousness. And almost 1 million blacks had left the South in the Great Migration and were moving to New York and Chicago and even some of the smaller cities. But Harlem became the center for African American life, attracting all the migrants from the South and the West Indies. And a lot of them were well-educated professionals and white-collar workers who were actually shocked by American racism. The crisis is publishing writings and even having contests and soliciting writings from other people. And they're getting very diverse writing, not just writings about what it was like to be a slave, but I mean, you've got poetry and stories and biographies. And you have Langston Hughes, who's a poet who writes about black pride. You got Jesse Redford Fawcett, who's a novelist who wrote Blacker Than the Berry. And Cunty Cullen, who's a poet, a minister's son, also the son-in-law of W.E.B. Du Bois. Charles Gilpin and Paul Robeson were stage actors. And the whites, well, I mentioned Eugene O'Neill, who's white, started writing about black things. He wrote All God's Children Got Wings. And black authors are also writing plays, and they're being performed by black actors. But the best known is the music of the day. The jazz, the blues, and the spirituals. For instance, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, written and performed by Henry Thacker Burlew. Now, I will say this, ladies and gentlemen, you probably are probably glad that you're not in my Black History class, because I happen to be a devotee of jazz. And when we get to this part of history and Black history, I'm afraid I usually spend more time than I should because I love jazz, and we'll play music of the people who were famous, you know. All the famous great singers and players of jazz and blues. And I just sit there and grin for a couple of semesters. Not such a semester, but a couple of lessons. But we have to be moving. We've got a very short semester, and so all I can do is mention a little bit of it. But I do want you to recognize Henry Thacker Burlew. He was a free northern black. His mother's employer was a very open-minded person, and she allowed him as a child to, I've got to attend musicals. He didn't really attend them. He kind of stood in the back and listened, because this was during the time when wealthy women and wealthy men would have these get-togethers where they would invite performers to come in, like pianists and soloists and singers, and perform in their home. And listening to the music, he developed a love of music, and he won a scholarship to the National Conservative Music which is unusual, but he was good at it, and he began writing spirituals. Of course, then you got blues. Now, I'm surprised we don't know more about blues here in Charleston, but where I'm from, it's not that far from the Mississippi River, and of course, W.C. Handy is called the father of the blues, and he's from a little town 32 miles away from where I lived. They have a big festival there every year. It's called the Father of the Blues, and he's not from there. He's really from Alabama. But he met his future wife in Henderson, Kentucky, and they lived there for a short time, so they claim him. In jazz, you've got Scott Joplin and Jelly Roll Morton and Louis Armstrong. The singers, you've got Ella Fitzgerald and Pearl Bailey, and of course in opera, you've got Marian Anderson. That woman has a voice that would charm a bird out of a tree. If you ever get a chance to go online, and she's great. You got authors, Toni Morrison, and a lot of times in college, the literature department will make you read Toni Morrison's Beloved. As a matter of fact, it's also a movie in which Oprah Winfrey starred the part, and it's about a Kentucky slave who escaped across to free Ohio and was hiding from the slave catchers before the Civil War. But they found out where she was and they came across, and to keep her children from being taken back to slavery, she kills them. It's based on a real story, but of course, in the book, you never know if she's talking to a real person, a ghost, or if she's going nuts. It's quite a story. You got Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God. But the place to be in Harlem was the Savoy Club and the Cotton Club. And both of these places were run by white people, but they had employed black people to do the serving and the cooking and the dancing, but black people could not be served. Even if you were a famous star like Ella Fitzgerald or Pearl Bailey, you could come in the back door and sing and perform, but you could not sit out front and be served. Zora Neale Hurston, she was a lady and a half. She called the white people who went to these clubs slumming niggeretti. So I always ask the question in the Black History class, and I'll ask you, did the Harlem Renaissance end? Yes and no. It came to an, like a lot of things, came to an end when the stock market crashed at the end of the 20s, going into the 1930s. Now, I've got two little short videos here. I've been meaning to ask you all, do you like the idea of having the lecture split into two parts? I prefer it that way, because that way I don't have to talk quite so long. But if you would prefer to have it all in one long lecture audio, I'll be glad to do it. But just send me a quick email, let me know how you think about it. This one video, it's about the flapper in the 1920s, the woman. The audio, it was produced by some unprofessional ladies, and the information is good, the pictures it's showing you is good. Just disregard the unprofessional audio.
Just one night, all we got. Just one night, all we got. Just one night, all we got. Just one night, all we got.
From 1920 to 1929, America experienced a period of great change, both socially and economically. Whether one blames World War I, women's suffrage, music, or prohibition, a newly accepted version of the woman emerged and impacted future generations. They were recognized for their bold actions, their daring character, their scandalous clothing, and especially their desire for equality with men. They were called flappers. The flapper was inspired by Charles Dana Gibson's drawings of the Gibson Girl. The Gibson Girl wore her hair loosely on the top of her head and wore a long straight skirt and a shirt with a high collar. She was feminine but also broke through several gender barriers for her attire, which allowed her to participate in sports including golf, roller skating, and cycling. During World War I, both boys and girls of this generation had broken out of society's structure. They found it difficult to return. In the age of the Gibson Girl, young women did not date. They waited until a proper young man formally paid her interest with suitable intentions. However, nearly a whole generation of young men had died in the war, leaving nearly a whole generation of young women without possible suitors. The young women decided that they were not willing to waste any of their young lives waiting. They were going to enjoy life. The Gibson Girl inspired a whole new type of woman who would soon be known as the flapper. The term flapper first appeared in Great Britain after World War I. It was there used to describe young girls, still somewhat in awkward movement, who had not entered womanhood. The idea of the flapper was introduced to Americans when the popular 1920 Francis Marion film, The Flapper, took theaters. It wasn't until then that the term flapper was used. F. Scott Fitzgerald, a writer at the time, described the idea of flapper as lovely, expensive, and about 19. Fitzgerald accentuated the flapper image by drawing young girls wearing unbuckled galoshes that would make flapping noise when they walked. It was believed that in America, a flapper was always giddy, attractive, and slightly unconventional young thing. Flappers had both an image and an attitude.
The flapper's image began with drastic changes in hair and clothes. Originally, women had long, luscious hair and then cut it short into a bob cut. They eventually cut it even shorter to a style called the shingle or Eton cut. Aside from cutting it, they also dyed it jet black. They topped it off with a felt, bell-shaped hat called a cloche. All clothing garments were shortened and lightened in order to make movement easier, such as dancing. Skirts started off long, but the flappers cut it, raising it inch by inch until finally in 1925 it fell just below the knee. Along with these short skirts, they also wore high heels. This new look was often considered as scandalous. Corsets or iron sides were replaced with underwear or step-ins. In order to look young and appear equal to men, they would tie cloth around their chest in order to fly on it. This look was referred to as garcony, which means little boy. In addition, flappers applied makeup, which was unusual for women in this period. Powder, eyeliner, and lipstick became the new trend. This new image also came with a new attitude. Women didn't want to waste their young lives, so they clinged to their youth, took risks, and were reckless. They were known for their fast lives and sexual behavior. They were also promiscuous and provocative. Their goal was to be looked at as different from the Gibson girl. They wanted to break away from the Victorian image of womanhood. They inherited male actions, including drinking and smoking.
One of the flappers' most popular pastimes was dancing. The dances ranged from many styles, but the more wild ones were Charleston, Black Bottom, and the shimmy. They frequently engaged in the active city nightlife by visiting jazz clubs and speakeasies, which was where they danced and drank. They snuck alcohol into speakeasies during the Prohibition by strapping flasks to their inner thighs. Young women were starting drinking early, and even though it was during the Prohibition era, flappers drank a lot of alcohol. To separate and differentiate themselves from the Gibson girl status, they started smoking, which was previously only done by men. Since cars were risky and fast, it fell into the flapper status, so many of them not only rode in them, but drove them. The end of the flapper era, the styles that the flappers used stayed. They continued to wear shorter skirts and shorts. They wore modern-day clothes and no longer wore corsets. They created what many consider the new or the modern woman. Many were shocked by the flapper's skimpy attire and new behavior, but the less extreme version of the flapper in the 1930s became respectable. Women continued driving, smoking, and drinking and fought for their social freedom they lacked before. But with this, the flapper's reputation died, and they grew out of being a rebellious person who just wanted to have fun but decided to settle down and get married. The flappers influenced the cartoon Betty Bop. She was the first and most famous sex symbol. Betty Boop's attitude describes the flappers, which was being carefree. She also wore skimpy attire similar to the flappers. F. Scott Fitzgerald took the ideas of the 1920s lifestyle with not only the parties but the flappers, and it's shown through several characters. Those characters were Daisy Buchanan, Jordan Baker, and Myrtle Wilson.
Now, like I said, the audio wasn't all that great, but I thought the pictures were great. I'm going to take some time and look for a short video to show you some of the different dances. But meanwhile, we got to do something about Harlem Renaissance.
greatest cultural periods in American history was during the time between World War I and the mid-1930s. The Harlem Renaissance was a period where black writers, poets, artists, and musicians, and photographers thrived in the small area called Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance was a period where black Americans' culture flourished and became a significant part of the American identity. The push that drove many black Americans north was mainly due to the bleak living the South provided. In 1910, 89% of all black Americans lived in the South, and most lived in rural areas. Between 1913 and 1915, sharecroppers fell into deep debt or lost about everything due to devastation of the cotton crops and floods. Also, the South still had Jim Crow laws, a large population of hate groups, and frequent hate crimes. Black farmers had a dim future, and the majority of the people sought for a better life. The industrial North showed a lot of promise with its cheap factory labor. Between 1919 and 1926, many black Americans moved from the South to the booming industrial urban areas, like Chicago, Washington, D.C., and especially New York. This was known as the Great Migration. Between 1920 and 1930, over 750,000 black Americans moved from the oppressing South to the urban areas in the North. The Harlem area in Manhattan alone attracted over 175,000 blacks. It was the most concentrated area of black Americans. With a large population of black Americans moving north and a large presence of lower-class white immigrants already in cities like New York and Boston, the black Americans were not taken in with open arms. As a result, most people coming from the South were pushed to live in the run-down areas of the cities, places like Harlem. The past history for many of the black Americans who moved north didn't hinder them. Many people found they had similar experiences, and instead of hanging on to their unpleasant history, these people celebrated their culture with pride. The Harlem Renaissance actually began when black Americans made their first artistic and literary achievement. It began around when James Weldon Johnson's novel, Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, was published in 1912. A few years later, there was another step forward in 1917 when the first desegregated magazine, Seven Arts, published 3 poems by Claude McKay. In that year, the first black American magazine, The Messenger, co-founded by Chandler Owen and A. Philip Randolph, was published. Also in 1917, for the first time, there were 3 plays with black cast members on Broadway. This was the beginning for independence for black American art and literature. In 1920, another Claude McKay poem called Spring in New Hampshire was published. Claude McKay was a well-known Jamaican-American poet and writer who was a key figure during the Harlem Renaissance. He's more famously known for his novel, Home to Harlem, that was published in 1928. However, Claude is not the most recognized poet of the Harlem Renaissance.
I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset.
This is Langston Hughes reading his poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, which he wrote when he was 19, right after he graduated high school. Hughes was an accomplished writer of fiction and drama, but better known for his poetry. He published 2 other famous works later in the 1920s, The Weary Blues in 1926, and Fine Clothes to Jews in 1927. There were many other significant poets from this time period. Countine Cullen, who had some famous works in the late 1920s, Jean Toomer, who published his famous novel Cain in 1923, and there were many other writers who became popular in the later years of the Renaissance. Although writing and poetry were a significant part of the Harlem Renaissance, music was also an important aspect of this time. Duke Ellington is considered to be one of America's greatest composers, recording artists, and band leader. He formed his band The Washingtons in 1923 and formed his own orchestra in 1927. Also that year, his orchestra started playing at the famous Cotton Club, a joint run by mobsters in Harlem that allowed only white audiences. By 1930, Duke and his band were broadcasted around the U.S., and they started touring around America and Europe in the 1940s. Duke is one of many significant artists from this time. Singing St. Louis blues is Bessie Smith, the most recognizable blues singer in the 1920s. She worked with other famous musicians, such as Louis Armstrong, who can be heard playing the cornet. Louis Armstrong is another very well-known musician who became increasingly popular in the 1920s. In 1929, he made his first appearance in Broadway with his performance, Ain't Misbehavin'. Other great artists from this time include Jelly Roll Morton, U.B. Blake, Fletcher Henderson, and many more. The music during the Harlem Renaissance inspired much of the art and dances of this time, like the Lindy Hop dance. Dancers were attracted to the Savoy, a place where whites and blacks could be found dancing together. During the Harlem Renaissance, many whites would travel to Harlem for entertainment. The hotspots that attracted both white and black Americans included the Savoy, the Cotton Club, and the Apollo Theater. Harlem was the heart and soul for black American culture. If anyone wanted to be a dancer, singer, artist of any form, they would come to Harlem at some point in time. Harlem was a crazy place to live in the 1920s, as clubs and joints were crowded from early afternoon to early morning the next day. However, around the time of the stock market crash in 1929 and the Great Depression starting soon after, the prosperity and the energy in the city quickly died down. The Harlem Renaissance was a movement for the new black American culture, as well as a celebration of their African American identity. It has left a huge print on the American identity, as art, music, and literature from that time are still looked at today.
Should have cut it off sooner, but I enjoyed the music. I hope you did too. So I'm going to call it quits with that, and we will finish up chapter 20, and as I say in my next little slide, the good, the bad, the ugly, and everything else that goes wrong in the 20s.